Hi, everyone. I hope you are doing as well as you can be, all things considered. I know that we've had a bit of an interruption to our course, so I wanted to create this talk to sort of help us think through some of the ideas from week 1 and 2 in our readings in preparation for our week 3 discussion. So these 3 weeks together form our module 1, which is focused on how we know in qualitative research and the history of qualitative inquiry. The main questions that I really want us to focus on are how knowledge is produced, justified, and contested in qualitative research, as well as the ethical and political consequences of how knowledge is produced in qualitative inquiry. And along with that, researcher stance. And then finally, our topic for week 3, which is experience as knowledge. So moving into our discussion, when we say qualitative research, what do we mean and what are we rejecting? So we're not just naming a particular method like interviews or a methodology like ethnography. Instead, we are naming a specific way of understanding knowledge. And in that, qualitative inquiry is more so concerned with interpretation rather than neutrality as a stance, and it is concerned with meaning made in context, not extracting from context. Again, coming to that neutrality. Qualitative research is understanding knowledge as situated rather than universal or a constant, and that it is value laden rather than detached. So qualitative researchers don't claim to be outside of the research, and instead they are in it. And that's important because qualitative research is always shaped by the values of the researcher, participants, broader society, power, and purpose. And importantly, in qualitative research, this is not seen as a weakness or a shortcoming or something to apologize for, because instead it is stance, an epistemological stance. And so in that, think about what's being rejected, the idea that research can or should be neutral, universal, or detached from social conditions. And like Denson and Lincoln remind, it's always stress that it is socially constructed. So, of course, this idea that we are describing when we talk about the knowledge claims and the epistemic stance that qualitative research comes out of is, of course, contested and has arisen from a particular place in history. So when we think about qualitative research as contested, it comes in response to historically dominant research traditions that treated objectivity as distant or universality as hallmarks of good research, and how we will define that. Positioning knowledge is out there waiting to be discovered, that's possible if it's done correctly. And so in doing so, these assumptions produce knowledge that is about people rather than with them. And so in response, qualitative inquiry pushes back on this, centering lived experiences, interpretation, reflexivity, and representation. And so thinking about the differences between those epistemic claims, when research is focused on the people, you get the opposite of this about them and the for them. And so you have heard this tension in education. This came up in the Denson and Lincoln article as well. The same turn and pushback against qualitative research happened in our field as well, with the move towards standardization, evidence-based, science of reading. They also, just like the positivist tradition, are not neutral descriptions, but are built on specific epistemic claims about what counts, who gets to decide, and what is put forth as knowledge and learning. And so Denson and Lincoln talk about qualitative research in response to this being a field that's defined by tensions, contradictions, hesitations, and qualitative researchers are working within them, which is when we get this metaphor of the bricoleur, who is using an assemblage of different tools together to make do with the assumptions and knowledge claims that we have in this contested terrain. And so, thinking about metaphors, I really do think that the metaphors matter because how we imagine research and the researcher and the researched really not only shapes but reflects how we think about knowledge. So I encourage you to think about them not just as language choices, but carrying epistemic assumptions about rigor, authority, responsibility, knowledge. So when you think about the dominant positivist traditions of research, research is often positioned as an extraction, a measurement, a discovery. And again, that harkens back to those stances of distance or control or objectivity. And we heard about the bricoleur, and then also in our text, Winters posits the mosaic. And so the mosaic has its own epistemic assumptions that knowledge is fragmented, incomplete, and the researcher pieces it together in interpretation, in a collective sense to make meaning. So think about some of the metaphors for research that are familiar to you, or that you might know. Mining data is another one. The authors talked about this as well. So those that might feel familiar or problematic and why. And again, thinking about how those metaphors signal who is the subject or object, participant, informant, and so on and so forth. So, thinking about the research process, the readings that we had this week talked about the research process not starting from method, but being built upon philosophical foundations, including ontology, epistemology, theoretical perspective, and researcher stance. So, Crotty gives us this vertical sequence and argues that epistemology comes first and informs the theoretical perspective and the subsequent methodology and methods. And similarly, Evans, Williams, and Esposito keep pulling us back. They add on to this by adding on ethics, intersectionality as conditions of what shapes what we can research and what questions can be asked. And then we also give this map, got this map from Denson and Lincoln in their article, who encourage starting with the researcher, and they provide their process as grounded in the historical political tension that they talk about, showing how the process is shifting in response to what's happening in the broader field and broader society, which is definitely relevant now. But you will see across all these that they all start, the process starts before method. And even if you start at method, you should go back and think about it at all places. And so, thinking about that, your research question is never neutral. Your research question, your research topic, your research interests already reflect so many assumptions about reality, knowledge, power, and whether or not you are going to name those assumptions. Again, this applies to all research, whether or not they claim these assumptions or not. So even though those diagrams in the text that you read and that we just looked at look linear, qualitative research certainly does not work in a linear fashion. It's where you might hear it being described as iterative or recursive. And so going back and forth between epistemology, theory, your stance, method, and constantly negotiating your assumptions in relation to those and the world and your participants is part of the process of research design. And once you start to articulate your stance, you can start to ask, what are some things that you assume are true about the world? And what do you assume is true about how knowledge is produced? So, thinking about how knowledge is understood in qualitative research across traditions, it is understood to be situated and produced within a specific historical, socio-historical, socio-political time that is impacted by the broader society, broader conditions. And so in that, it's viewed in qualitative research, knowledge is viewed as constructed rather than discovered. It's situated instead of universal and this value-laden idea. And Dinson and Lincoln remind us of this intimate relationship between the researcher and what is being studied and how the situational constraints shape inquiry. And so understanding that knowledge doesn't just simply describe the world or reflect the world, instead it participates in shaping it. And so that's why knowledge production is an ethical and consequential act, because those claims have consequences for of people for whose realities count, whose realities are rendered invisible, and what narratives count, what narratives are rendered invisible, and so on and so forth. So that's why this is so important to consider when you are working on your study. And so we also got a really nice discussion about intersectionality as both a theoretical frame or lens and as an epistemological stance. So taking this conversation further about epistemology, you can see how a particular epistemology has all of these assumptions, and recognizing to start that neutrality itself is a standpoint. Um, and it often aligns with dominant power and upholding inequitable power structures, even though those assumptions are not explicitly teased out, they're still there. And so, as an epistemological frame, intersectionality functions in that way by shaping the questions that we ask and expanding what counts as knowledge and evidence, and importantly, recentering power in knowledge production. And in thinking about this, it builds on the theoretical framework and repositions it as a knowledge sense-making process, that experiences aren't just additive and that systems of oppression can't just be understood in isolation. Those are some of the assumptions in the knowledge-making process. And it doesn't just describe identity, but reorganizes what we mean. And in that, some of the questions that might be asked about dominant traditions, just thinking about how they might have defined what is normal or objective or rigorous, and intersectionality asks who pays the costs for that. And so when we think about epistemology and particular assumptions within that, it's also important to think about the researcher stance and how we as researchers contribute to the knowledge-making process. And there are at least three different aspects of how we as the researcher contribute epistemic claims and assumptions to the process. So first, subjectivity, the idea that we're always in the research, that we're not this external looking down, that we are in it, and there is no escaping it. And so we read our article about that this week. And then also positionality, that we are all located within and negotiating this shifting relation of power within our study. It might be socially, institutionally, historically, the interpersonal. And so that's why you can't just have it as a statement or a checklist, because it's constantly in flux. And mitigated not just by you, the personal, but by structural factors that are constantly moving as well. And then thirdly, standpoint, the social position or location where you find yourself. And standpoint is so important in shaping what can be known and how knowledge can be taken up from your particular vantage point, and how different epistemic standpoints don't have access to that knowledge in the way that you do. And so many of the readings that we had really take up this idea of these three different, now they're not interchangeable, but these three different aspects of what we bring and how we shape knowing have epistemic consequences. So thinking about subjectivity as inevitable, positionality being a negotiation, and standpoint being accountability to your social location with that. And so when we think about standpoint, some of the readings also pushed us, and Collins really pushed us to understand standpoint as not just individual experience, but carrying much more epistemic weight than that. One of the ideas that we read about was standpoint can be collective and structural and produced together through our shared histories and our relationship and position to power. So when we position experience as something that only an individual has, we risk stripping it away of some of its epistemic potential. And so standpoint theory reminds us that this knowledge emerges through power and not outside of it. So it's interdependent in that way. Another key reminder from standpoint epistemology is that not all experiences carry the same epistemic weight. And if you chose the Hernandez Riviera piece, you read about counter spaces as a space to help clarify that, and that knowledge collectively together can become, or experience together can become knowledge when interpreted together with community and the political context. So we talked about metaphor being an important way to locate you. And another way that you can think about this is in your language. So your language really reveals, reflects your assumptions and your epistemological stance without you even realizing it. So when you are thinking about your research, describing your research interests, the verbs that you use really matter. So when we read about this in some of our texts as well, there are verbs that are extractive that assume stability or distance. Maybe they're um, measuring or hypothesizing. There's also interpretive or representative verbs that hearken to ethics and relationality and some of the responsibility to represent or center, and then critical refusals of power, some verbs related to that as well. So I am curious what verbs you resonate with, which ones bother you and why, and how you might tease out your epistemic assumptions through the verbs and the metaphors that you're using. And so this brings us in preparation for our week 3 about experience. And so if we, and we'll talk about this in class, if we treat experience as automatically true, we really stop interrogating the epistemic weight and conditions around experience. And if we treat experience as irrelevant, then we are reduced to dominant epistemologies that dismiss lived experience, and we don't want to go back there, right? So qualitative inquiry sits in between those. And so experience, and many of you discuss this in your memos, has been dismissed as subjective, not verifiable, incomplete. And so thinking about how, and then other times experience is presented as just self-evident in and of itself. And so neither of those are sufficient. And so we are going to be talking about that. And as Collins reminds us, experience is a starting point, not an ending. So, as you look ahead, I know that we are early, but I do want you to start tracing on these readings and discussions to your epistemological statement paper that is due in March. So, when you are articulating your stance, you'll need to work on making your assumptions visible. Like, what do you believe can be known and how? How do you understand your role and responsibility as the researcher? How does power shape interpretation? And importantly, what are you refusing? Now, I really want you to make sure that you are engaging in this because developing your stance is not just about choosing or picking epistemology or theory from a menu. So the readings that you're doing and the authors that you are using to help shape your thinking are not categories to sort yourself onto, but rather resources for you to think with and start to develop your stance. So, when you are engaging with the literature and your own introspection and discussion, your goal is to craft a stance that's grounded, specific, and accountable, both to the literature and the scholarship and to you as the researcher. And so as you're doing this, again, it's iterative, recursive, and remember that memos are often tentative instead of definitive and show your thinking in motion over time and your rethinking over time. We even saw that in the Collins piece this week about the reflection on a previous contribution. And so I want to leave you with this question for you to start thinking about as you develop your stance, what assumptions about knowledge, reality, and power are embedded in your research. And so that is the work that we will be working on in our next class. And so I look forward to reading all of your comments and insights in perusal.